deserve it, but we need to not take this lightly and ensure that our reputation is maintained. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker.
I call Fletcher Tabuteau.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to take a call on this, the Regulatory Systems Building and Housing Amendment Bill, Commercial Matters Amendment Bill, Workplace Relations Amendment Bill. And I do want to start by praising Mr. Bailey in particular, although I would like to include the Minister, Minister Bridges, and I think Mr. Young also deserves to be included in the praise. I think in their case, less is more. And Mr. Bailey proved that with his 30-second contribution to the House. And I do commend the Minister for taking all of 2 minutes to tell the people of New Zealand what's in this bill, why it's good for them, and how it will change their lives. It was just probably the best contribution I've heard from Minister Bridges in years, or at least as long as I've been in this House. So I'd like to continue on this positive and collegial motif, if you will, sir, Mr. Speaker, and say it's genuinely nice to speak in favour of government legislation when New Zealand First agrees, in the main, with a large proportion of the legislation. And I do accept, for once, well, not for once, but very rarely do I accept the intent of the legislation as described by the government is actually what will be achieved by the legislation they actually provide to the House. But in this case, Mr. Speaker, I have to say the intent is good, and actually the legislation itself backs it up and does what they say it will. I think there's a reason for that. I think we have to reflect on the fact that we're talking about legislation which originated from the, I think it was June 2014 Productivity Commissioner's report. And they made the note at the time how difficult it is to get repair and fix-up legislation in the House. It takes time and it's quite difficult to get it advanced. And we are talking about 20 pieces of legislation here, Mr. Speaker, that need, it was described as repairs and maintenance. And I think it's fair to say that 2014, it's probably taken a few years too long for this government to bring progress this legislation this far. We are talking about businesses and people who have missed out on potential flow-on benefits or been had to be a burden of extra or entrenched costs because this legislation had not been changed in a timely fashion. I've had several conversations with business and individuals about this legislation, and I have to say what I heard from them actually reinforced the submissions to the Select Committee. And these amendments will achieve effectiveness and efficiency by clarifying and updating statutory provisions. It's a very rare and privileged thing for me to say in regard to government legislation. These bills will reduce the chance of regulatory failure and the unintended consequences that can harm the well-being of New Zealanders. The amendment bills will improve the laws that affect business, building and housing, energy, communications, commerce and consumer affairs and workplace relations regulatory systems. In the main, each of the changes are small, Mr. Speaker, and again, agree with the government, they do not warrant standalone legislation. No, Mr. Ross. There was an exception to that, actually the Select Committee progressed, I think it was Clause 20 of the Commerce Regulatory Amendment Bill around unit titles, where they said this is probably out of the mandate and we shouldn't go here. But to be fair to the Select Committee, that was what was done. What I want to say, and what seems to have worked with tax legislation, is the kind of pre-conversation and engagement with the public before government actually drafts these bills. And this regulatory reform bills were a case in point where the government did use a, what did they call it? Exposure draft being used effectively. So actually, whilst I commend the government's legislation on this day, what I think it reflects is engagement with community before they actually drafted the bill, and they actually listened to this, well, not submitters, but to the feedback from shareholders and stakeholders, and then they didn't actually attempt to change that feedback too much, because in their mind it was small and inconsequential, as it were. With not too much time to go, it seems to have been a theme in the House to acknowledge, in particular, sir, the changes to the Construction Contracts Act. New Zealand First, and I acknowledge along with others, and actually I do wish to acknowledge individually the work of Clayton Cosgrove on the Select Committee with regard to his efforts to broaden the way that the retention of money for subcontractors is protected. And I do just want to dwell on that section of this legislation because it is worthy of note. And New Zealand First has for a long time been making that call for those protections. The amount of engagement we've had, particularly with those subcontractors in Christchurch who have had to deal with, you can say, kind of dodgy business practice, and what it's done to, especially the sole owner, sole operator business down in Christchurch, and what it's meant to individuals' lives. So if you permit, Mr Speaker, the committee did propose several changes that made it clear to how to apply for those retention obligations. From the end of this month, I believe, the Construction Contracts Amendment Act will require that retention of monies, which will be held under commercial construction contracts in trust. So this ensures that developers and head contractors must protect retention money for the benefit of those subcontractors or payees. The feedback was fair, though. That does make it hard on some of those big operators in terms of retention of that money in trust and then their working capital. But then, again, to the credit of the Select Committee, they acknowledged that it would be expensive and difficult for some payers under the CCAA requirements. So they were given options, basically, and New Zealand First did support the committee's proposed amendments, which would give two options. The second being an insurance or a payment bond as an instrument to provide third-party protection for the retention of said money. The committee did make it clear, Mr Speaker, that any financial instruments obtained must meet strict requirements. I will just take this brief opportunity to again acknowledge the government's efforts here. This is actually a good fix-up bill. It is a good tidy-up bill, and New Zealand First is pleased for once to commend legislation to the House. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
I call Brett Hudson.